480 of religious traditions, the history of languages, and the origins of human civilizations. The growing involvement with other cultures undermined the old Europe and its ideas, just as Europe was undermining the old cultures beyond the oceans. Vast new horizons opened before Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries. Europeans of this period were the first people to know the whole globe, to establish colonial outposts around most of the world, or to realize the variety of the human race and its multifarious manners and customs. Cross-cultural encounters. The current of skepticism. Travelers' tales and cultural relativism, 481. This encounter with the diversity of human cultures was very unsettling. The realization of human differences had the effect, in Europe, of breaking what has been called the cake of custom. A new sense of the relative nature of social institutions developed. It became harder to believe in any absolute rightness of one's own ways. Montaigne, already mentioned, expressed the relativist outlook clearly, and nowhere more clearly than in his famous essay on cannibals. The cannibals, he said humorously, did in fact eat human flesh. That was their custom, and they have their customs as Europeans also have theirs. They would think some European ways odd or inhuman. Peoples differ, and who are we to judge? The cannibals cooked human bodies after the people were dead, but Europeans burned human beings when they were still alive. Travelers' books spread the same message increasingly through the 17th century. As one of them observed, whether or not rightly, in Turkey it was the custom to shave the hair and wear the beard. In Europe, to shave the beard and wear the hair. What difference does it really make? That the ways of non-Europeans might be good ways was emphasized by Jesuit missionaries. Writing from the depths of the Mississippi Valley or from China, the Jesuit fathers often dwelt on the natural goodness and mental alertness of native peoples they encountered, perhaps hoping in this way to gain support in Europe for their missionary labors. Meanwhile, people coming from the American wilderness or from Asia, sometimes 257-482 appeared in Europe itself. In 1684, a delegation of aristocratic Siamese arrived in Paris, followed by another in 1686. The Parisians went through a fad for Siam, now Thailand. They recounted how the king of Siam, when asked by a missionary to turn Christian, replied that divine providence, had it wished a single religion to prevail in the world, could easily have so arranged it. The philosophical Siamese seemed civilized and wise. They allowed Christians to preach in their own country, whereas it was well known what would happen to a Siamese missionary who undertook to preach in Paris. China also was seen at this time as a civilized center of learning, tolerance, and wise ethical traditions. By 1700, there were even professors of Arabic at Paris, Oxford, and Utrecht who said that Islam was a religion to be respected, as good for Muslims as Christianity was for Christians. Thus was created a strong current of skepticism, holding that all beliefs are relative, varying with the time, place, and culture in which they develop. The greatest spokesman for this kind of relativism or skepticism at the end of the century was Pierre Bayle, 1647 to 1706. Bayle was also influenced by the scientific discoveries, not exactly that he understood them, for he was an almost purely literary scholar, but he realized that many popular beliefs were without scientific foundation. Between 1680 and 1682, a number of comets were seen. The one of 1682 was studied by a friend of Newton's, Edmund Halley, the first man to predict the return of a comet. He identified the comet of 1682 with the one observed in 1302, 1456, 1531, and 1607, and predicted its reappearance in 1757. It appeared in 1759. It was seen again in 1910 and 1986, and is still called Halley's Comet. In the 1680s, people were talking excitedly about the significance of comets. Some said that comets emitted poisonous exhalations, others that they were supernatural omens of future events. Skepticism Bayle, in his thoughts on the comet, argued that there was no basis for any such beliefs except human credulity. In 1697, he published his Historical and Critical Dictionary, a tremendous repository of miscellaneous lore, conveying the message that what is called truth is often mere opinion, that most people are amazingly gullible, that many things firmly believed are really ridiculous, and that it is very foolish to hold too strongly to one's own views. Bayle's dictionary remained a reservoir on which skeptical writers continued to draw for generations. Bayle himself, having no firm basis in his own mind for settled judgment, mixed skepticism with an impulse to faith. Born a Protestant, he was converted to Roman Catholicism, then returned to his Calvinist background. In any case, his views made for toleration in religion. For Bayle, as for Montaigne, no opinion could justify burning your neighbor at the stake. Bayle's Critical Dictionary, The New Sense of Evidence, 483. But in the study of humankind, as in the study of physical nature, Europeans of the 17th century were not generally content with skepticism. They usually sought to go beyond a doubting mood, important and salutary as such an attitude was. In the subjects collectively called the humanities, as in pure science, they were looking for a more advanced understanding of human behavior. They wanted new means of telling the true from the false, a new method for arriving at some degree of certainty of conviction. And here, too, a kind of scientific view of the world arose, if that term is understood in a general sense. The new human sciences took the form of a new interest in observable evidence. Evidence is that which gives one good reasons to believe that a statement is true, or at least truer than something else for which the evidence is weaker. And if to 258 believe without evidence is the sign of non-scientific or irrational thinking, to require observable evidence before believing is in a way to be scientific, or at least to trust and use the power of human intelligence. The arrival of a second delegation of ambassadors from Siam at Versailles in 1686 made a vivid impression on a French generation that often read about distant lands and peoples. Although this portrayal of the visit by the French artist Charles Lebrun confirmed that the bowing ambassadors showed the requisite respect for the Sun King, their presence in France contributed to a growing speculation on cultural differences and the relativism of cultural customs. Print collector, Getty Images, 484. The new belief in the need for evidence revealed itself in many ways. One of the clearest was in the law. The English law of evidence, for example, began to take on its modern form at the close of the 17th century. It was long believed that less evidence should be necessary in arriving at a verdict of guilty in trials for the most atrocious crimes. This was thought necessary to protect society from the more hideous offenses. From the end of the 17th century, in English law, the judge lost his power of discretion in deciding what should constitute evidence, and the same rules of evidence were applied in all forms of accusation, the essential legal question becoming always the same: did such and such a fact, however outrageous, occur, or did it not? After 1650, mere hearsay evidence, long vaguely distrusted, was ruled definitely out of court. After 1696, even persons charged with felony were allowed legal counsel. English Law of Evidence 259, Evidence and Witchcraft, History and Historical Scholarship, 485. The new emphasis on empirical evidence was probably the main force in putting an end to the delusionary charges of witchcraft. What made witchcraft so credible and so fearsome was that many persons confessed themselves to be witches, admitting to supernatural powers and to evil designs upon their neighbors. Many or most such confessions were extracted under torture. Reformers urged that confessions obtained under torture were not evidence, that people would say anything to escape unbearable pain, so that no such confessions offered the slightest ground for believing in witches. As for the voluntary confessions, and even the boastings of some people of their diabolical powers, it was noted that such statements often came from persons who would today be called psychotic. Witches came to be regarded as self-deluded. Their ideas of themselves were no longer accepted as reliable or objective evidence. But it must be added that, except in England, the use of legal torture lasted through most of the 18th century in criminal cases in which the judge believed the accused to be guilty. The systematic study of past human societies, which would come to be called the historical sciences, also developed rapidly at this time. History, like the law, depends on the discovery and use of factual evidence. The historian and the judge must answer the same kind of question: did such and such a fact really occur? All knowledge of history, insofar as it disengages itself from legend, propaganda, or wishful thinking, rests ultimately on pieces of evidence, written records, and other material objects created in the past and surviving in some form or other down to the present. On this mass of material, the vast picture of the past is built, and without it, people would be ignorant of their own antecedents or would have only folk tales and unconfirmed oral traditions. Oral history often shapes personal and collective memories, and it provides important information. But judges and historians know that people remember the same events with very different facts and perspectives. There was thus much skepticism about history in the 17th century. Some said that history was not a form of true knowledge because it was not mathematical. Others said that it was useless because Adam, the perfect man, neither had nor needed any history. Many felt that what passed for history was only a mass of fables. History was distrusted also because historians were often pretentious, claiming to be high-flying men of letters, writing for rhetorical or inspirational appeal, or for argumentative reasons, disdaining the hard labor of empirical study. History was losing the confidence of thinking people who came to view science as the model for reliable knowledge. How was it possible, they asked, to feel even a modicum of certainty about alleged events that had happened long before any living person had been born? This doubting attitude itself arose from a stricter sense of evidence, or from a realization that there was really no proof for much of what was said about the past. But scholars set to work to assemble what evidence they could find. They hoped to create a new history, one that should contain only reliable statements. Europe was littered with old papers and parchments. Abbeys, manor houses, and royal archives were full of written documents, many of them of unknown age or unknown origin, often written in a handwriting that people could no longer read. Learned and laborious enthusiasts set to work to explore this accumulation. They 486 added so much to the efforts of their predecessors as virtually to create modern critical scholarship and erudition. The French Benedictine monk Jean Mabillon, in 1681, in his book on diplomatics, referring to ancient charters and diplomas, established the science of paleography, which deals with the deciphering, reading, dating, and authentication of manuscripts. The Frenchman Ducange, in 1678, published a dictionary of medieval Latin that is still used. Other historians spent whole lifetimes exploring archives, collecting, editing, or publishing masses of documents, comparing manuscript copies of the same text, and trying to discover what the author had did. 260. New historical scholarship, the growth of geographical knowledge, 487 really written, rejecting some texts as fabrications or forgeries, pronouncing others to be genuine pieces of historical evidence. Others made themselves experts in ancient coins, many of which were far more ancient than the oldest manuscripts. They founded the science of numismatics. Still others, or indeed the same persons, turned to a critical examination of the inscriptions on old buildings and ruins, looking for the earliest possible information about specific people or events. The four maps show the best scientific knowledge at their respective dates. Baham has no inkling of the existence of America and has filled in the hemisphere opposite to Europe with a mass of islands, representing what he has heard of the East Indies and Japan. He knows pretty well the limits of Africa. Schoner in 1523 fills in America and even distinguishes two American continents. He knows of the Gulf of Mexico, but fails to realize the narrowness of the Isthmus of Panama. He knows of the Straits of Magellan, but not Cape Horn, and hopefully fills in a corresponding Northwest Passage in the north. His conception of the Indian Ocean is quite accurate. To Homan, 2 centuries later, the size and shapes of oceans and continents are well known, but he believes New Guinea is joined to Australia and is frankly ignorant of the northwest coast of North America, representing it by a straight line. The Great Lakes and the interior of North America have become known to people in Europe. Danville in 1761 has no island of Tasmania, does not understand that Alaska is a peninsula, and believes the American polar regions to be impassable by sea. Otherwise, his map is indistinguishable from one on the same scale today, though the cultural interpretations or meanings of geographical spaces have continued to evolve. 261 488. Another important but little-known historical science, namely chronology, was also pursued with new attention to precise evidence and dates. Chronology deals with the age of the world and with finding a common denominator between the dating systems of various peoples. Probably it is not natural for the human mind to think in terms of dates at all. For non-historically minded people, or for people who are little concerned with verifiable evidence, it is enough to know that some things happened long ago. In the 17th century, the new interest in numbers, evident in physical science, turned also to the human past. Archbishop James Ussher, an Anglican prelate of Ireland, after much study of the Bible, announced the date of 4004 BCE as the year in which the world was created. His chronological system was later printed in the margins of the authorized version of the English Bible, and some fundamentalist Christians still adhere to it as if it were part of the Bible itself. But Ussher's system was not accepted by scholars even in his own time. New geographical knowledge was revealing China and its dynasties to Europe. Historical knowledge was beginning to discover ancient Egypt. The Chinese and Egyptian records claimed a greater antiquity for their countries than the Old Testament seemed to allow for the human race. There was much erudite conjecture. One scholar about 1700 counted 70 estimates of the age of the world, ranging as high as 170,000 years, a figure that then seemed fantastic and appalling. The early modern interest in the preservation and study of historical materials led to a systematic organization of the libraries and sources that careful scholarship would require. This Dutch engraving of a library in Leiden, based on a 17th century painting by Jan Cornelius Woedanis, shows the subjects that scholars studied and the tables at which they stood to read the books. Although women were not present in this scholarly meeting place, the engraving shows that dogs apparently had free access to the library's main reading room. Culture Club Getty Images, 489. The difficulty was not only in the language of the Old Testament, it was in finding the correspondence between the chronological systems of different peoples. A Chinese system of dating by dynasties might be coherent within itself, but how could it be equated with the European system of dating from the birth of Christ, a date as little known to the Chinese as the date of Wu Wang was to Europeans? Even European records presented 262 the same difficulty. The Romans counted by consulships, or from the supposed year of the founding of Rome. Many medieval documents told only the year of an obscure ruler's reign. Only infinite patience, interminable research, and endless calculation could reduce such a jumble to the simple system of modern textbooks. This is of more importance than may be at first recognized. A common system of dating is a great aid to thinking of human history as an interconnected whole. An overall conception of the human race is made easier by the dating of all events according to what Europeans called the Christian era. This itself, it may be pointed out, is an arbitrary and conventional scale, because Christ is now thought to have been born not in 1 CE, but in 4 BCE. Common dating was increasingly important for practical affairs as well as for historical knowledge. Europe was disunited even on the Christian calendar. Protestant and some Orthodox countries followed the Old or Julian calendar. Catholic countries, the corrected or Gregorian calendar issued in the 16th century under authority of Pope Gregory XIII. The two calendars varied in the 17th century by 10 days. Only gradually was the Gregorian calendar accepted, by England in 1752, by Russia in 1918. Most other peoples today, in China, India, the Arabic one elsewhere, use or recognize the Gregorian calendar as a shared calendar for modern global life. Without a uniform way of specifying days and years, it would be difficult to transact international affairs, hold international conferences, make plans, or pay and receive money. A global system for defining time and dates thus became essential for global economic exchanges and communications. This common dating, easily taken for granted, was a consequence of the expanding global influence of Europe in modern times, and it became both a symbolic and a practical expression of the exchanges between different cultures in the modern world. A common system of dating. The questioning of traditional beliefs 490. The historical sciences provided a foundation on which a knowledge of human activities in the past could be built, and the growing geographical knowledge provided a panorama of human diversity in the present. This new knowledge shared with natural science the view that many traditional ideas were erroneous, but that much could now be known by a more disciplined use of the human mind. The humanities and the sciences were alike in demanding evidence for belief and in trusting the power of reason. In their impact on the traditional certainties of European life, the studies of human cultures exerted possibly a greater direct force than those of nature. Pascal, in his defense of the Christian faith, feared the spirit of Montaigne, the mood of skepticism and the denial of universal certainties, which he himself feared more than he feared the findings of mathematical and physical science. And the movement of historical thought, with its insistence on textual criticism and verifiable evidence, threw doubt on much of the Christian religion, or at least on the sacred history and miracles related in the Bible, which was considered to be part and parcel of religion itself. In 1678, a French priest, Richard Simon, published a pioneering work in biblical criticism, his critical history of the Old Testament. Although his book was condemned both by the Church and by the government of Louis XIV, Simon always felt himself to be an Orthodox Christian. Catholic faith, he insisted, depended more on church tradition than on the literal statements of the Bible. He simply applied to the Old Testament the methods of textual criticism that others were applying to secular documents. He concluded that the Old Testament, as known, rested on medieval manuscripts, many of which were of 263–491 unknown or doubtful origin, that monkish copyists had introduced errors and corruptions, and that the books thought to have been written by Moses could not have been written by him, because they contained obvious contradictions and matter clearly inserted after his death. Others went further, questioning not merely the evidence of the biblical text, but the very possibility of some events that it related. From the scientific idea of the absolute regularity of nature on the one hand, and from a strong sense of human credulity on the other, they denied that miracles could have ever occurred, and they looked upon oracles and prophecies among either the Greeks or the Hebrews with a dubious eye. Biblical Scholarship and Criticism, Chronology of Notable Events, 1543, 1697-1543 publication of Copernicus on the Revolution of the Heavenly Orbs and Vesalius's The Structure of the Human Body. 1609, Galileo builds Adelscope, 1620–1627. Francis Bachenarg for Empirical Method to Advance Knowledge, 1637, René Descartes publishes Discourse on Method, 1651, Thomas Hobbes publishes Leviathan. 6662 Royal SETI for Improving Natural Knowledge is chartered in London. 1666 Royal Academy of Sciences is founded in Paris. 1687 Isaac Newton publishes Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. 1690 John Locke publishes Essay Concerning Human Understanding and two treatises of government. 1697 Pierre Bayle publishes Historical and Critical Dictionary. 492 The most profoundly disturbing of all thinkers of the time was Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, the lens grinder of Amsterdam, a Jew whose ancestral family had emigrated from Portugal to escape the repression of Jewish communities in Iberia. Spinoza became an independent-minded, skeptical philosopher who was excommunicated by his own synagogue and who refused a professorship at the University of Heidelberg, craving only the quiet to think in peace. He drew on both the scientific and humanistic thought of his day to develop a philosophy holding that God had no existence apart from the world, that everything was itself an aspect of God, a philosophy technically called pantheism, but considered by many to be really atheistic. Spinoza therefore rejected Cartesian dualism, but he also denied the inspiration of the Bible, disbelieved in miracles and the supernatural, rejected all revelation and revealed religion, Jewish or Christian, and held that few, if any, governments of the day were really just. He taught a pure, stern, and intellectual ethical code, and one that had few consolations for the average person. His name became a byword for impiety and horrendous unbelief. People were literally afraid to read his works, even when they could find them, which was not often because of the censorship. His influence spread slowly through the mediation of other writers, contributing to the development of 18th century rationalist philosophy. Baruch Spinoza. More widely read, less abstruse, were the writings of the Englishman John Locke, 1632 to 1704, who summarized many of the intellectual trends of his lifetime and exerted a strong influence for the following 100 years. He combined practical experience and 264 theoretical interests in a philosophy that dwelled on the merits of common sense. Educated in medicine, he kept in touch with the sciences and was acquainted with Newton. He was associated with the great Whig noblemen who were the main authors of the English Revolution in 1688. For political reasons, he spent several years in the 1680s in the 493 Netherlands, where he became familiar with new philosophical work on the continent. He wrote on many subjects: finance, economics, education, religious policy, political theory, general philosophy, always with an engaging directness and the sober air of a sensible man of the world. In his letter on toleration, 1689, he advocated an established church, but with toleration of all except Roman Catholics and atheists. These he held to be dangerous to society, the former because of a foreign allegiance, the latter because they lacked a basis of moral responsibility. In his reasonableness of Christianity, he argued that Christianity, rightly considered, is after all a reasonable form of religion. This softened the friction between religion and natural knowledge, but tended to shut out the supernatural and merge religious feeling into an unruffled common sense. Locke's deepest book was his Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1690. Here he faced the great philosophical problem of the day, the problem of knowledge and skepticism. He asked if it was possible to know anything with certainty, and how certain knowledge was arrived at. His answer was that true or certain knowledge is derived from experience, from perceptions by the sense organs and reflection of the mind on these perceptions. Locke at the end of the century thus echoes Bacon at the beginning. They became the two great pillars of empirical philosophy, insisting on experience and observation as the source of truth. Locke denied Descartes' doctrine of innate ideas, or inevitable disposition of the human mind to think in certain ways. He held that the mind at birth is a blank tablet or tabula rasa, and that the social environment shapes what people think or believe. Locke's environmentalist philosophy became fundamental to liberal and reforming thought in later years. It seemed that false ideas or superstitions were the result of bad 494 environment and bad education. It seemed that the evil in human actions was due to bad social institutions, and that an improvement in human society would improve human behavior. This philosophy, whether or not wholly true in the final analysis, was largely true with respect to many practical conditions. A better education, for example, seemed to offer better opportunities for personal advancement and social well-being. Locke's philosophy thus gave confidence in the possibility of social progress and turned attention to a sphere in which planned and constructive action was possible, namely the sphere of government, public policy, and legislation. Here we touch on political theory, to which Locke contributed 2 treatises of government. These works are discussed later in this chapter. Locke's view of knowledge? The Dutch Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, portrayed here in a painting by Samuel van Hoogstraten, developed a materialist or pantheistic philosophy that provoked strong opposition from many of his contemporaries. But Spinoza became an influential thinker for later writers who expressed skepticism about traditional religious beliefs. Bettman, Getty Images, Bendiges, 30. Political theory, the school of natural law. Political theory can never be strictly scientific. Science deals with what currently exists or has existed. It does not tell what ought to exist. To describe what society and government ought to be like, in view of human 495 nature and the capacity to be miserable or contented, is a main purpose of political theory. Political theory is in a sense more practical than science. It is the scientists and scholars who are most content to observe facts as they are, and even when they seek to improve material conditions, they do not seek or expect to change the basic structures of the natural world. Practical people, however, and those scientists and scholars who have practical interests, must always ask themselves what ought to be done, what institutional structures ought to be changed, what policies ought to be adopted, what measures ought to be taken, what state of affairs ought to be maintained or brought about. Conservatives and radicals, traditionalists and innovators are alike in this respect. It is impossible in human affairs to escape the ethical and political implications of ought, or to stop thinking about possible changes in social and political systems. But political theory was also affected by the scientific view. The Renaissance Italian Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, whom we have discussed earlier, had opened new critical thinking in this direction. Machiavelli, too, had his ought. He preferred a republican form of government in which citizens felt a patriotic attachment to their state. But in his book The Prince, he focused on the best strategies for exercising political power, rather than on more abstract questions about the best form of government, a favorite question of Christian and scholastic philosophers in the Middle Ages. He separated the study of politics from theology and moral philosophy. He undertook to describe how governments and rulers actually behaved. He observed that successful rulers behaved as if holding or increasing power were their only object, that they regarded all else as means to this end. Princes, said Machiavelli, kept their promises or broke them, told the truth or distorted it, sought popularity or ignored it, advanced public welfare or disrupted it, conciliated their neighbors or destroyed them, depending merely on which course of action seemed the best means of advancing their political interests. All this was bad, said Machiavelli, but that was not the question, for the question was to find out what rulers really did to gain and hold power. Drawing his conclusions from the observable evidence of history, Machiavelli chose to be non-moral in order to produce what might be 496 called a scientific account of political power. To most readers, he seemed to be simply immoral, nor was it possible to draw the line between The Prince as a scientific description of fact and The Prince as 266, a book of maxims of conduct. In telling how successful rulers obtained their successes, Machiavelli also suggested how rulers ought to proceed. And though governments did in fact continue to behave for the most part as Machiavelli said, most people refused to admit that they ought to. Niccolò Machiavelli, Natural Right and Natural Law. Political theory in the 17th century did not generally embrace the cynicism attributed to Machiavelli, nor did it fall into the skepticism of those who said that the customs of one's country should be passively accepted, or that one form of government was about as good as another. It directly faced the question, what is right? The 17th century was the classic age of the philosophy of natural right, or of natural law. The early modern idea of natural law underlies a good deal of modern democratic development, and the decline of this idea became a philosophical aspect of most anti-democratic movements in more recent times. It is not easy to say in what the philosophy of natural law essentially consisted. It held that there is somehow, in the structure of the world, a law that distinguishes right from wrong. It held that right is natural, not a mere human invention or cultural construction. This right is not determined for any country by its heritage, tradition, or customs, nor yet by its actual laws, called positive laws, of the kind that are enforced in the law courts. All these may be unfair or unjust. We detect unfairness or injustice in them by comparing them with natural law as we understand it. Thus, we have a basis for saying that cannibalism is bad or that a law requiring forced labor from orphan children is unjust. Nor is natural law, or the enduring rightness of something, determined by the authority of any person or people. No king can make right that which is 497 wrong. No people, by its will as a people, can make just that which is unjust. Right and law, in the ultimate sense, exist outside and above all peoples. They are universal, the same for all. No one can make them up to suit themselves. A good king or a just people is a king or people whose actions correspond to the objective standard. But how, if we cannot trust our own positive laws or customs, or our leaders, or even our collective selves, can we know what is naturally right? How do we discover natural law? The answer, in the natural law philosophy, is that we discover it by reason. Philosophers of natural law said that human beings are rational animals, and they assumed that all human beings have, at least potentially, and when better enlightened, the same powers of reason and understanding, Germans or English, Asians, Africans, or Europeans. This view favored a cosmopolitan outlook and made international agreement and general world progress seem realizable goals. As time went on, the premises of this philosophy came to be questioned. By the 20th century, it was widely thought that the human mind was not especially rational, but was motivated by unconscious drives or urges or instincts, and that human cultural differences were so fundamental that people of different nationalities or classes could never expect to see things in the same way. Challenged by such theories of human irrationality and cultural difference, which could be promoted with much ancient and modern evidence, the older philosophy of a universal natural law lost its hold on many minds. Natural law and natural right, 498. In the 17th and 18th centuries, however, it was generally accepted. Some, carrying over the philosophy of the Middle Ages, thought of natural law as an aspect of the law of God. Others, more secular in spirit, held that the natural law stood of itself. These included even some churchmen. A group of theologians, mainly Jesuits, were condemned by the Pope in 1690 for holding that universal right and wrong might 267 exist by reason only, whether God existed or not. The idea of natural law and the faith in human reason went side by side, and both were fundamental in the thought of the time. They were to be found everywhere in Europe, in their religious or their secular form. Critiques of natural law. On the basis of natural law, some thinkers tried to create a new international law, or law of nations, to bring order into the maze of sovereign territorial states, great and small, that was developing in Europe. Hugo Grotius, in 1625, published the first great book devoted exclusively to this subject, his Law of War and Peace. Samuel Pufendorf followed with his Law of Nature and of Nations in 1672. Both held that sovereign states, though bound by no positive law or authority, should work together for the common good, that there was a community of nations, as of individuals, and that in the absence of a higher international sovereignty, they were all still subordinate to natural reason and justice. Certain concrete doctrines, such as the freedom of the seas or the immunity of ambassadors, were put forward. The principles of international law were seen as an extension of natural law. The content came to include specific agreements between governments, certain kinds of admiralty and maritime law, and the terms of treaties, such as the treaties of Westphalia, Utrecht, and others. Such laws and treaties expressed transnational principles or agreements, even though the means for enforcing such principles remained weak or non-existent in the era's endless political conflicts and wars. They could nevertheless be viewed historically as the first halting steps toward a more legally coherent, international, and secular management of political affairs among the emerging modern European states. Law of Nations, 499. No philosopher at the time thought the state could have an absolute value in itself. Natural right and natural law were held to be in the nature of things, beyond human power to change. Forms of government were thus viewed as the means to an end, the institutional adherence to natural law. The state had to be justified by making it acceptable to moral consciousness or to reason. In domestic affairs, the philosophy of natural law, though it rather favored constitutionalism, was used to justify both absolutist and constitutional governments. On the side of absolutism was the doctrine of the divine right of kings. On the side of constitutionalism were arguments based on heritage or custom, emphasizing the charters or compacts of former times and the historic powers of towns, parliaments, and estates. But neither the supernatural argument of the divine right of kings, nor the historical argument pointing back to liberties of the Middle Ages, was entirely satisfactory in the scientific atmosphere of the 17th century. Neither argument could be completely justified within the frameworks of reason or morality that now shape the ideas of the most acute European thinkers. Both the absolutist and the constitutional views of government were therefore reinforced in the 17th century by the concept of natural law, and two English political theorists showed most clearly how both sides in this debate built their opposing arguments on similar foundations of natural law. Absolutism was philosophically justified by Thomas Hobbes, constitutionalism by John Locke. Competing views of natural law, 500 Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, followed the scientific and mathematical discoveries of his time with more than an amateur interest. In philosophy, he held to a materialistic and even atheistic system. In English politics, he sided with the king against Parliament. He disliked the disorder and violence of the Civil War of the 1640s and the unstable conditions of the English Republic of the 1650s. He concluded that humans have no capacity for self-government. His opinion, 268, of human nature was low. He held that people in the state of nature, or as they could be imagined to exist without government, were quarrelsome and turbulent, forever locked in a war of all against all. In his famous phrase, life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Acting on their fear of each other and seeking to obtain order or enjoy the advantages of law and right, people came to a kind of agreement or contract by which they surrendered their freedom of action into the hands of a ruler. It was necessary for this ruler to have unrestricted authority, because order could be maintained only by the exercise of absolute government powers. It was intolerably dangerous, according to Hobbes, for anyone to question the actions of government, for such questioning might reopen the way to chaos. Government must therefore be a kind of Leviathan, the monster mentioned in the Bible, Job 41. And Hobbes, in fact, used the word Leviathan for the title of his principal book, published in 1651, 2 years after the execution of King Charles I. Absolutism and Thomas Hobbes, 5001. By this book, Hobbes became the leading secular exponent of absolutism and one of the principal theorists of the unlimited sovereignty of the state. His influence on later thinkers was very great. He accustomed political theorists to the use of purely natural arguments. He quoted freely from the Bible, but the Bible had no influence on his thought. After Hobbes, all advanced political theorists regarded government as a device created by human purpose rather than as part of God's divine dispensation to human history. Hobbes also affected later theorists by his arguments for a sovereign authority, which obliged them to refute his idea of an unlimited personal sovereign. But he was never a popular writer. In England, the cause that he favored lost influence in the course of the 17th century revolutions. In those continental countries where royal absolutism prevailed, his arguments were received with secret gratification. But his irreligion was too dangerous to make public, and the absolutist argument on the popular level remained that of the divine right of kings. In any case, Hobbes's arguments were in some ways insufficient for real monarchs. Hobbes abhorred struggle and violence. He believed that absolutism would produce civil peace, individual security, and a rule of law. He also held that absolute power depended on, or had at least originated in, a free and rational agreement by which people accepted it. An absolute monarchy that flagrantly violated these conditions could with difficulty be justified even by the doctrines of Hobbes. It is in these respects that Hobbes differs from totalitarian theorists of more recent times. For Hobbes, in the final analysis, absolute power was an expedient to promote individual welfare. It was a means to advance or protect the realization of natural law. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, as has been seen, also stood in the main current of scientific thought and discovery. But in his political philosophy, he carried over many ideas of the Middle Ages, as formulated in the 13th century by St. Thomas Aquinas and kept alive in England by successive thinkers of the Anglican Church. Medieval philosophy had never favored an absolute power. With Hobbes, Locke shared the idea that good government is an expedient of human purpose, neither provided by divine providence nor inherited by a national tradition. He held, too, like Hobbes and the whole school of natural law, that government was based on a kind of contract, or rational and conscious agreement upon which authority was based. In contrast to Hobbes, he sided with Parliament against the king in the practical struggles of politics. About 1680, in the course of these disputes, he wrote 2 treatises of government, which, however, were not published until shortly after the parliamentary revolution of 1688 to 1689. Constitutionalism and John Locke. Locke took a more genial view of human nature than Hobbes. As he showed in his other books, he believed that a moderate religion was a good thing, and above all, that 269,502 people could learn from experience and hence could be educated to an enlightened way of life. These ideas favored a belief in self-government and a more constitutional conception of state power. Locke declared, in contradiction to Hobbes, that people in the state of nature were reasonable and well-disposed, willing to get along with one another though handicapped by the absence of public authority. They likewise had a moral sense, quite independently of government, and they also possessed by nature certain individual rights, quite apart from the state. These rights were the rights to life, liberty, and property. Locke placed heavy emphasis on the right of property, by which he usually meant the possession of land. His philosophy can in fact be regarded as an expression of the landed classes of England, who challenged the power of kings by defending the political and social rights of private property. Individuals in the state of nature are not altogether able, according to Locke, to win general respect for their individual natural rights. They cannot by their own efforts protect what is proper to them, that is, their property. They agree to set up government to enforce observance of the rights of all. Government is thus created by a contract, but the contract is not unconditional, as claimed by Hobbes. It imposes mutual obligations. The people must be reasonable. Only rational beings can be politically free. Liberty is not an anarchy of undisciplined will. It is the freedom to act without compulsion by another. Only rational and responsible creatures can exercise true freedom. But adult human beings, according to Locke, are or can be educated to be rational and responsible. They therefore can and should be free. Locke never really explained how these political rights, obligations, and freedoms might apply to women as well as to men, so there has been much modern debate about Locke's theoretical contributions to later campaigns for women's rights. In his own early modern context, however, Locke's writings explicitly supported the political rights and obligations of men who were claiming an active role in government affairs. On government also, as Locke described it, certain conditions and obligations are imposed. If a government breaks the contract, if it threatens the natural rights that it is the sole purpose of government to protect, if, for example, it takes away a man's property without his 503 consent, then the governed have a right to reconsider what they have done in creating the government, and may even, in the last extremity, rebel against it. The right to resist government, Locke admits, is very dangerous, but it is less dangerous than its opposite, which would lead to the loss of all liberty. And in any case, Locke assumes that those who might resist the government in such situations would still be reasonable and responsible people. If Locke's ideas seem familiar, especially to Americans, it is because of the wide popularizing of his philosophy in the century after his death. Nowhere was his influence greater than in the British colonies. The authors of the American Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution of the United States knew the writings of Locke very thoroughly. Some phrases of the Declaration of Independence echo his very language. In Great Britain also, and in France and elsewhere, in the course of time, Locke's influence was immense. But it should be noted that his ideas did not always mean the same thing for all people or in all places. Locke did not extend his ideas of human liberty to enslaved Africans, apparently because he viewed slavery as a legitimate form of private property. Locke himself invested in the slave-trading Royal African Company and endorsed the development of slavery in the American colonies. The growing influence of Locke's political theories may also have contributed indirectly to the emergence of new racist ideas in the 18th century. New justifications for slavery became necessary when the political classes of England and America began to believe that human beings possessed natural rights to life, liberty, 270, Locke's influence, 504, and property. How could slavery be reconciled with such beliefs? The answer appeared in new forms of racism, which justified the enslavement of Africans by arguing that the African race lacked certain rational human traits of the European race, and that Black people could be denied fundamental human rights because they differed from other human beings. By Godfrey Kneller, English, 1646 to 1723. Locke's writings on government and natural rights summarized the arguments against royal power in England and also won adherents wherever political theorists challenged monarchical absolutism. Heritage Images, Getty Images. In general, however, Locke's ideas of natural rights and human liberty were later used to challenge absolutist or repressive institutions, including also the slave trade and the legal systems that supported slavery. The right to human liberty, including the liberty of enslaved persons, would eventually be viewed as more universal or more natural than certain property rights of slaveholders, though slavery would not be abolished in most European colonies or post-colonial nations until the 19th century. Meanwhile, Locke's theories of contractual government gained international influence in the evolving debates about monarchical power. What Locke did was to convert an episode in English history into an event of universal political meaning. In England, in 1688, certain great lords, winning the support of the established church, gentry, and merchants, deposed one king and brought in another. On the new king, they imposed certain obligations, specified in the Bill of Rights of 1689, and all dealing with legal or technical interpretations of the English 505 Constitution. The Revolution of 1688 was a very English affair. England in 1688 was still little known to the rest of Europe. The proceedings in England, insofar as they were known to most Europeans, might seem no different from a rebellion of the magnates of Hungary. Locke, in arguing that Parliament had been right to eject James II, put the whole affair on a level of reason, natural right, and human nature. It thus came to have meaning for people who had no connection with the specific problems of English political history. 271 Locke on the English Revolution. 506. Locke made the English Revolution of 1688 a sign of progress rather than reaction. The new and modern form of government in 1690 was royal absolutism, with its professional bureaucracy and corps of paid officials. Almost everywhere, there was resistance to the kings, led by landed interests and harking back to earlier freedoms. Such resistance seemed to many Europeans to be feudal and medieval. Locke checked the prestige of absolutism by showing how the resistance to an English king was a forward-looking movement. He gave new prestige to constitutional principles. He carried over, in modified form, many ideas from the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages, who had generally maintained that kings had only a relative and restricted power and were responsible to their peoples. To these ideas, he added the force of the newer scientific view of the world. he did not rest his case on supernatural or providential arguments. He did not say that constitutional government was the will of God. He said that it rested on experience and observation of human nature, on recognition of certain individual rights, and especially the right of property, and on the existence of a purely natural law of reason and justice. He was an almost entirely secular thinker, and as such, he developed ideas that could be drawn into the political and social conflicts of most modern nations. One must not claim too much for Locke, or for any writer. England was, in fact, in 1688, already more inclined toward constitutional government than other countries in Europe. The Glorious Revolution was, in fact, not exactly like uprisings of the landed and propertied classes elsewhere. England, in the following century, did in fact develop a form of parliamentary government that was unique. But facts go together with the theories that give them an understandable meaning. Events in England, as explained by Locke, and as seen in other countries, and even in England and its colonies through Locke's eyes, launched into the mainstream of modern history the superb tradition of constitutional government, which has been one of the principal themes in the history of the modern world ever since. By 1700, at the close of the century of genius, some beliefs that would become widely characteristic of modern times had clearly taken form, notably a faith in science, in human reason, in natural human rights, and in progress. The new scientific knowledge was beginning to transform the global economy, the culture of European elites, and the conflicts within or among European empires. Meanwhile, the cultural institutions of modern science were spreading across Europe, and new scientific theories in physics, astronomy, and physiology were challenging both the theology and thought systems of earlier generations. The following period, generally known as the Age of Enlightenment, was to be a time of clarifying and popularizing ideas that the more creative 17th century had produced. These ideas were eventually to revolutionize Europe, America, and the world. They were also in subsequent years to be modified, amended, challenged, or denied. Indeed, modern critics and governments have often ignored or rejected early modern ideas about reason, rights, and science. But these ideas are still very much alive today.